To what extent do you think that the writer of John knew Synoptic? Is it he knew them by like oral tradition, or when he write his gospel, he had them in front of him and copy them?
He knew them really well. I think he actually owned copies. I mean, obviously, this is speculation, degrees of knowledge, but given the way in which he can just introduce a synoptic phrase kind of out of nowhere into the middle of a story, I think this is someone that knows the synoptic gospels really, really well. He might even have Mark's gospel by heart. This is something that Helen Bond suggests, that he might even have almost complete memory recall of Mark's gospel. But either way, no, I think he knows all three synoptics really, really well. I think he'd been working with them for some years, and I think that familiarity actually shines through in his gospel when you read it against the background of the synoptics. So yeah, I think it's a literary knowledge. I think he actually had physical copies or access to physical copies that he got to know very, very well.
Welcome to Scripture and Scholarship. My name is Peyman Salar, and today I am honored to have Dr. Mark Goodacre with me, who is a professor of religious study at Duke University, and he is specialized in New Testament and Christian origin and research interest, including Gospels and historical Jesus, and so many other things. So, Dr. Goodacre, thank you very much for joining me.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. I follow you on social media, on Facebook and YouTube, always learning from your scholarship. Today, actually, we are talking about this book, the newest book by Dr. Goodacre. It's called The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, John's Knowledge of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So before I start, I look into even the picture in that, which I like. It's somebody plagiarizing somebody else.
Yeah, it's a brilliant picture. It's from a Dutch artist, and I also have to look his name up. He's but he Erdmans, my publisher, chose the cover image. My suggestion for the cover was that we could use P52, which is one of the oldest papyrus fragments of any of the Gospels, potentially the oldest, and it's a piece of John's Gospel, and it's a piece of John's Gospel, chapter 18. And I thought the reason it would work in this book is that the very thing that's on P52 is Jesus' trial before Pilate, and it features one of my key examples, one of my favorite examples of John's knowledge of Luke's redaction of Mark. So, I thought if we put P52 on the front, we could then have on the inside, on the front, we can see P52. This is part of John 18, which Goodacre argues it shows John's knowledge of Luke. But I think they thought it would be a bit boring to have just a piece of papyrus on the front cover. So instead, they went with this absolutely beautiful Dutch painting. So I was very happy with that.
Yeah, it's very nice. So I'm going to admit something that because last year in SPL, actually I purchased a book, but before I got your book, I got this book that helped me to understand the concept of your book. So, and I know that you have 1 articles in this one. So
Yes.
I read that too. And so for people who wants to actually know more about the debate and about the discussion, so it's better to have this book too, because it just for me was like kind of background of what actually is here. So
yeah, my article in that book is actually I partly reuse some bits from it in this book. So did it as a talk at the Society of Biblical Literature, and I kind of liked it. So after putting it in that book, I adapted it into this. I think that article's on my website as well. But the book as a whole is excellent. The 3 editors are excellent scholars, Helen Bond, Catherine Williams, and Eva Marie Becker. And it's full of some really great articles. Chris Keith's got a great article in there. You've got a fantastic article by Harry Attridge and by Catherine Williams herself, by Helen Bond herself. So, I mean, some really, really good stuff in there. So I like that book a great deal.
Okay, did this book change the game or not yet?
Well, we'll see. I suppose the honest answer is that the situation's been changing already, and I think to an extent my book is timely because I think already there are a lot of people who are much more open to the idea that John knew the Synoptics. So one example of that is that book that we were just talking about, John's Transformation of Mark. Another book recently that came out was James Barker's Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. And Andrew Lincoln had already published an excellent commentary on John's Gospel that presupposed that John knew the Synoptics and argued that John knew the Synoptics. So I think that old view that John was independent has already shifted quite a bit. And really all I'm doing is just I don't know, jumping on the bandwagon, but to an extent also trying to provide a really as clear as I can case that goes stage by stage to say this is how we can illustrate John's knowledge of the Synoptics. So I wonder, see, all of those other books we've talked about, they're all fantastic, but none of them sets it out as a case. I wrote a book on Q called The Case Against Q. I like to lay out the case, 1, 2, 3, etc., like that.
Very good. So, Dr. Goodacre, let me ask you this because I read the book and I love it. But
Thanks.
I wanted to know more about the reception history behind the question. Enlighten us about this, about like 2nd century until 20th century.
Yeah, sure. Well, what happened really is quite easy to summarize. That for most of history, people have thought that John knew Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's just been the main kind of position for hundreds and hundreds of years. Right back to Clement in the 3rd century that said that he thought that John had written with knowledge of the other 3. So lots of people have seen it really as 4th gospel, as the 4th gospel in the canon that you read alongside the 3 others. And then everything changed in the 20th century. Really, it's the middle of the 20th century that this happened. The person that's always given the first credit for changing the field was Percival Gardner Smith in the late 1930s. He was a Cambridge academic. He wrote a little book, it's not very good, on St. John and the Synoptic Gospels. And the thing, though, that really shifted things was his colleague at Jesus College, Cambridge, was called C.H. Dodd. And Dodd was a gifted New Testament scholar in a way that Percival Gardner Smith wasn't. And Dodd wrote a couple of books that really made an impact: Historical Tradition in the 4th Gospel and The Interpretation of the 4th Gospel. And Dodd was such a gifted communicator and such a great researcher that he really carried the day for a lot of people. It became not the consensus position, but definitely I think it would be fair to say majority position, really going forward right through the late 20th century, 2nd half of the 20th century. And one of the reasons for that isn't just because Dodd was a gifted writer, but because all of the classic books on John's Gospel that were published in the late 20th century went for this idea that John is independent. So Raymond Brown, J. Louis Martin, my teacher John Ashton, they all worked with a model where John is independent. And so that really carried the day right into the 21st.
What was the main argument of the guy who just changed the game in 20th century?
Well, I suppose the big thing is C.H. Dodd, like Percival Gardner Smith and like all the others, thought that oral tradition was sufficient to explain the similarities between the Synoptics and John. And they wanted to lean very heavily into the differences between the Synoptics and John and argue that the differences really are the most important thing, and the differences make it pretty clear to them that John didn't know the Synoptics. And then when you do have these links, they say the links aren't close enough for literary familiarity. So they argued, generally speaking, for oral tradition, though you also get a significant group of people who argued that John was using a hypothetical written source, which they usually call the Science Gospel or the Semea source. And the Science Gospel got pretty popular as a thesis as well. So you either get oral tradition or the Science Gospel, or sometimes both, as being the sources for John, but not the Synoptic Gospels.
To what extent do you think that the writer of John knew Synoptic? Is it he knew them by like oral tradition, or when he wrote his Gospel, he had them in front of him and copied them?
He knew them really well. I think he actually owned copies. I mean, obviously this is speculation, degrees of knowledge, but given the way in which he can just introduce a synoptic phrase kind of out of nowhere into the middle of a story, I think this is someone that knows the Synoptic Gospels really, really well. He might even have Mark's Gospel by heart. This is something that Helen Bond suggests, that he might even have almost complete memory recall of Mark's Gospel. But either way, no, I think he knows all three synoptics really, really well. I think he'd been working with them for some years. And I think that familiarity actually shines through in his gospel when you read it against the background of the synoptics. So yeah, I think it's a literary knowledge. I think he actually had physical copies or access to physical copies that he got to know very, very well.
Okay, interesting, interesting. So, so let us know what do you think about the location of, I mean, the recipient of the Gospel of John and the author, and a little bit background of the John that you work on. So
Yeah, we don't have any idea who the real author of the gospel was. I mean, we simply don't know. We can say certain things about the author. I mean, for one thing, the author does have pretty good knowledge of Judean geography. I mean, like a lot of the stuff that he says about Judea, check out. So, I think that he does know some stuff. He's certainly, if you read something like the infancy gospel of Thomas, which doesn't, which is not much later than the Gospel of John, that just has no knowledge that we can tell, that we can see of the geography of Israel, Galilee,
uh-huh.
Judea at all. And the Gospel of Thomas is similar. You can barely name a place, but John has this amazing detail, and quite often the detail checks out historically. So the author does know those things. He's got a pretty good knowledge of Judaism, but a real hostility to the leadership of Judea in this period, and that's one of the fascinating things about the gospel. But all in all, we have no idea though where this guy lived, and what his name was. I think that, and I argue this in the book, that he is evoking the tradition of John, the son of Zebedee. I think that he paints himself as an idealized witness, and he kind of invites the reader to identify him with John, the son of Zebedee, and as the beloved disciple. And one of the reasons for that is that John, the son of Zebedee, is never mentioned by name. He's like really conspicuous by his absence, but
Uh-huh.
side by side with him is Peter. Now, side by side with Peter in the Synoptics is John, the son of Zebedee. So it's a very easy equation to make, and it's an equation that lots and lots of people have made across the years. So that's who he's. He's coy. He doesn't state it outright in so many words, but I think it's strongly implied that that's who he is. But I don't think the historical John, son of Zebedee, wrote the
Yeah.
gospel.
So about the argument of John knowing Mark even by heart, or knowing literally text of Mark. I mean, if we're going with a traditional view that Mark has been written like in Rome, and let's say John in Ephesus, do you think that in like 30 years or 35 years, is a good kind of time that somebody in Ephesus can get access to Mark, can get Mark very well?
Well, the fact is that Matthew and Luke, if we accept the very, very widespread theory of Markan priority, then two Gospels before John have got hold of Mark. And we have no idea where Matthew and Luke were geographically, but both Gospels appear to regard Mark as something of an authority because they copy out huge swathes of that document. So Mark's Gospel definitely seems to have got around quite a bit. It's already mentioned by Papias in the early 2nd century. So yeah, I mean, I think you only have to hear about a gospel to then go and get a copy, because what you then can do is you can send your scribe or one of your servants or enslaved people to go and make a copy, and you have to be a person of means to do that. But that's what you do. You don't actually, let's say for the sake of argument, Mark does come from Rome. It travels away from Rome quite quickly. Let's say it's found its way to, I don't know, let's say for the sake of argument, John was written in Ephesus. It might have found its way to Ephesus within months of being written, and then, you've got plenty of time for the author of the 4th gospel to get to know it.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we have like a synopsis of the gospel, Mark and Luke and Matthew, and then start reading it even in English, not in Greek, everybody can recognize, okay, probably, priority of Mark is just all over the place. But
Mhm.
if we want to put John beside it, those lines and those verbs, those sentences, I've read your argument that there is a lot you can find, but is not as much as like Matthew or Luke. And why was that?
Yeah,
Why
so
not adopting more?
well, this is the thing that's misled people. What's happened is they've read the Synoptic Gospels and then they've assumed that the kind of copying that Matthew does of Mark, that Luke does of Mark and Matthew, or some people think Mark and Q, they think that level of copying is normal. And it's not. It's really unusual. So what's happened is we've been seduced by Matthew and Luke. We look at Matthew and Luke and we think that the way that they copy is the way that everybody who copied documents would copy, and it's not. John is much more the norm in this respect, because basically what you do as an ancient writer, if you're writing a dependent work or a work that has sources, you basically paraphrase your source material. And that's really what John does when he shares things with the Synoptics. So is then a question, it's not a difference in kind, it's a difference in degree. You have to say how much agreement is there. It's not that you've got the Synoptics over here and John over here. What you've got is a different degree of copying. And yes, much less copying by John of the Synoptics than there is by Luke of Mark and Matthew, for example. But there is still interesting verbatim agreements. And they pop up quite often with unusual words, which enable you to diagnose the kind of literary links. So yeah, I think that's the problem. See, basically people, and I include myself in this, you absorb yourself in the synopsis of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And you do start thinking that that is the normal way to behave. And then you get to John and people go, well, this is different. Therefore, John didn't know them, but it doesn't work that way. Differences don't diagnose independence. It's the similarities that do.
Beautiful.
Well, similarities that diagnose dependence.
Okay. So because I actually watched and listened a series that you did on the Biblical Studies Academy on Mysteries of Synoptic Gospels. And I have to say that from lesson 6 to lesson 13, I watched every single lesson more than 3 times.
Gosh, sorry about that.
I love that.
Were you having trouble sleeping or something?
I love that. And yeah, I was taking notes and things that you go through. So that's why I actually wrote on my paper here some question based on those. So
Sure.
yeah, I love. Lecture 7, you talk about the birth narrative, which is one of my favorite things to do. So when it comes to Josephus and Quirinius and Luke, these issue that it seems that never solved. So my question is why one should read Josephus over Luke. I mean, and I understand that you mentioned in that lecture that when it comes to political issues, probably, Josephus, most of the time he's right because he loves political things. But why not reading it vice versa, that Luke may be right and Josephus maybe got it wrong? Do you think there's a valuable on that too?
Well, the thing is, for a start, we have to look at the evidence that Luke knew Josephus. And the evidence that Luke knew Josephus is not as strong as the evidence that Luke knew Mark or Matthew, in my opinion, but it's still there. It's another one of these things where the evidence isn't as overwhelming as the evidence is for Luke's knowledge of Mark or Matthew, but the evidence is nevertheless still there. And if the question is, why should we trust Josephus over Luke? My answer is that we can check Josephus's details lots of the time with the archaeology and with the coinage, and usually he checks out. So in other words, when he tells us stories about political figures and their interrelations, when we can check them out, he's usually right about them. So things line up. So even though Josephus tells us fantastic stories at times, he says that just before the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, he says that a cow gave birth to a lamb. Now, that's not very plausible historically, but the details about the destruction of the temple line up with other stuff that we get from archaeology, like the Titus Arch in Rome. So you have to say that we have reason to trust Josephus when it comes to lots of the politics and the history. Luke is a little harder to trust in certain things. Luke is generally a pretty good historian, But there's certain things where he's difficult to trust because they don't line up with other knowledge we have. The clearest one is the one you mentioned about Quirinius, because if Jesus was born when Quirinius was governor of Syria and when he was doing the census, this is a good 10 years after Herod the Great died. And it's not just that Herod the Great is mentioned in Matthew's birth narrative, it's that he's mentioned in Luke's own birth narrative in Luke 1 verse 5. So
Mm-hmm.
the two events are simply not actually aligned in the right way in Luke. We have reason to trust Josephus there, and we have less reason to trust Luke. But
Mm-hmm.
often he's reliable. He actually knows these names like Quirinius, governor of Syria. I mean, he does know that. He says that John's ministry began in the 15th year of the Emperor Tiberius. That's about right, because that would make it 2930. That sort of maps with what we can gather from elsewhere, including Josephus. Same thing as, like, he knows that Pilate's first name was Pontius. He didn't get that out of Mark or Matthew. He knows that Caiaphas was in cahoots with Annas, which, I mean, Annas not mentioned by Matthew or Mark. And you can keep going on with these things and seeing how a lot of the time what Luke says really checks out historically, but
Okay.
sometimes it doesn't.
So if Josephus is right about Quirinius and dating, so my point is, if he is right on that, how do we know that, for example, like if like Josephus says that, I mean, about dating, and Luke says something different, so
Mhm.
is it there's like I mean, Josephus here and Luke here, do we have any other any other things that in favor of Josephus, any other sources outside of the...
Because you have the archaeology. I mean, so broadly speaking, I mean, like, so to take a sort of easy example, the one I mentioned about Pontius Pilate. So Luke and Josephus both call him Pontius Pilate, but so does Philo, and so does a dirty great step that was found in Caesarea Maritima, which has his name on it. Well, it has Tius, the end bit of Pontius, on it.
Yeah.
So, you have little things like that align. So, yeah, I mean, so that's where you can go externally.
No, I mean, my Dr. Goodacre, my point is about Quirinius and his
Right, okay.
ruling date. Do we have
Mhm.
any other source beside Josephus that's supporting Josephus?
So basically, we get that detail from Josephus. It's actually mentioned in the Jewish War as well as in Antiquities. But the thing that you have to do is say, do the details that Josephus tells us align with other things in the archaeological record? So in this case with Quirinius, the reason Josephus says that Quirinius was brought in to arrange this census is because Archelaus had just been deposed. So we then go, okay, let's check for Archelaus. And so we look and we find there's some coinage of Archelaus that looks like it fits to this period. You have to look at, when you're doing archaeology and literary history, you have to look at networks of agreements and disagreements. If you pull out one thing, there's another thing still standing. So that they're the kind of things that you have to do. And it makes perfect sense that what would have happened in a case where you have an absolutely disastrous leader like Archelaus is that Rome will then send someone in their place, which is basically what they did. And this is why Quirinius is doing the census, because Rome needs to find out what's cracking off down there before it sends its new procurator or prefect down there. So you have to, when you're doing ancient history, you never have an abundance of evidence, but you have to do the best you can with the pieces that you do have.
So speaking about Luke, so I want to hear your take on the first two chapters of Luke. So like people like Ehrman or others like argue that probably like if you read like Marcion, probably the Marcion Gospel doesn't have the two chapters probably.
Yeah.
And so that's why we have like genealogy of Jesus, and it seems that chapter 3 verse 1 is just beginning of the gospel. So what do you think about this argument?
I don't have any time for it. Thing about the reason why people think that Luke might have begun at Luke 3:1 is because he has this elaborate dating where I was just mentioning it, where he talks about 15th year of the Emperor Tiberius, and then he puts everybody else in their place. There's a reason why he's doing it. It's the same reason that when we watch all these TV shows and films that we watch, they'll actually have to say 79 when they've just shown something that was taking place in 1870 because you're updating the narrative. What's happened is we've just gone from Jesus's upbringing in Nazareth and the incident of the boy Jesus in the temple, and now we're fast forwarding by about 20 something years. So Luke could have done what Matthew did in Matthew 3:1, and he could have just said, around that time. But it's weird to say that. In those days? Well, it's not those days. This is decades later. So I think what Luke's doing is a very, very natural thing. He's bringing the reader up to date in where we are in the narrative. And if we ask the question, does he do that elsewhere? Absolutely he does. He does it one chapter earlier in the very verse we've been talking about, Luke 2:1, where he tries to date the census precisely to a point in time. So nobody says that Luke's gospel begins at 2:1. That this thing has got people got stuck on with 3:1. It really, to me, is simply Luke responding to Matthew 3:1, which has this very vague introduction. And instead of saying in those days, he says, I'm going to tell you exactly when this took place. And the reason why Marcion would not have Luke 1 and 2 is obvious. It's full of this very Hebrew Bible, kind of, it's just, the whole thing is imbued with Old Testament motifs of the kind that, it just doesn't work in a Marcionite theology very well. No, and how much textual evidence is there for Luke being absent at chapters 1 to 2? None whatsoever. Every copy that we have of the Gospel of Luke, has those first 2 chapters in there. So I think they were always there. Besides which, they're written in Luke's style. I mean, it just looks like it's the same author.
But I mean, when you read the first 4 verses in Luke, it's just so polished. Is not Luke. It's like upper level, a Greek, it seems to me.
Oh, it's perfectly Luke. It's perfectly Luke.
It's perfectly Luke.
I mean, this is the thing that people miss about Luke, and it's one of the reasons that we get into the whole mess over the Q hypothesis as well. Q's got a very versatile style. He has a far larger vocabulary than Matthew or Mark, and he has many more cases where he just introduces just one word at a time, a hapax legomenon. He has many, many more of those than Matthew and Mark have. So people mistake Luke's broad style and his ability to vary his synonyms for him using source material or there being a different author at a different point and so on. But it's Luke 1:1 to 4 makes perfect sense as a nice Greek preface of a work like Luke's Gospel. And yes, it is very different from verse 5 when we suddenly go into the temple and meet Zechariah, but that's the skill of Luke. If you read the whole of his if you think of it as a 2-volume story, Luke's Gospel and Acts, as you push through Acts, as you get further and further away from Jerusalem, the Greek gets more and more, the Greek gets less and less Semitic. It's a very clever thing that Luke's doing. You begin the Gospel in this really Hebraic way, so it's anchored in Israelite history. And then by the time we've got to Rome at Acts 20, it gets there before Acts 28, but by the time we get to Rome, he's basically got to the gospel having reached, the nation. So I think that's what's going on in Luke. It's not really that mysterious.
Although he knew that Matthew wrote it this way, but he changed it knowing that this is Matthew's text, and then he changed it. How can I solve the problem of having a source before me and that I change it dramatically? Is it just based on because I research or I interview eyewitnesses, or I think that Matthew is wrong and I'm right? How can I understand?
Some of all of those, but I would say the issue is if you jettison the idea of the Magi being involved in the story, you basically lose pretty much the entire story. And we know that Luke doesn't like Magi. One of the villains of Acts of the Apostles is called Simon Magus. That's simply the singular for Magi. So Luke's not going to put Magi at the heart of his story. Well, as soon as you've taken the Magi out of that story, you've lost the story. The whole story revolves around the Magi coming from the east. They go to talk to Herod, saying, where's the person that's going to be born king of the Jews? And Herod doesn't like that idea because he thinks he's the king of the Jews. So he then tells the Magi to, the whole network of the story, basically the fabric of Matthew 2 involves those Magi. So if you're Luke and you've decided, no, we're not going to have a story around Magi, what are we going to do? I mean, you can't have the shepherds going to Herod's court and talking to Herod. He would say, what are these shepherds doing in my... So if you're then deciding you're going to write a different story, you then got to say, well, how do you write your different story? And Luke has a really, really clever way of doing it. He wants to begin the gospel from Jerusalem. And so he really makes Jerusalem the whole kind of basis of the thing. He still wants to do something that Mark's gospel does, which is Mark's gospel begins with John the Baptist. We know that Luke thinks that John the Baptist represents the beginning of Jesus's mission because he says that in Acts of the Apostles as well, in the preaching. So how do you square those things? It's like, how do you square that circle? Well, what you do is you begin with John the Baptist, but you tell the story of the birth of John the Baptist. And that then allows you to craft a story around their mums, Elizabeth and Mary. So I think, and then I suppose the other thing I have to say is, if Luke knows Matthew, which I think he did, then you expect him to at least show some knowledge of Matthew there. And he does. In the story of the Annunciation, you have exactly the same line spoken to Mary that is spoken to Joseph in Matthew's gospel, which is, you shall have a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. And in Matthew's gospel, this is spoken in the singular to Joseph, where it makes perfect sense because Luke thinks that men did name their sons, whereas in Luke it's spoken to Mary, and actually that's kind of strange because it's not going to be Mary that names him Jesus. It's going to be both of them. So yeah, it's I don't have any trouble seeing Luke as knowing Matthew's birth narrative at all. I just don't think he liked it very much. And I think most of history has agreed that Luke's is the superior one because Luke does give us all of those details that are romanticized and made part of Christmas cards and Christmas pageants and nativity stories and so on. So no, I don't think there's a difficulty seeing Luke knowing Matthew's birth narrative. I think there's a bigger problem for people that think that Luke is independent from Matthew, because then you've got to say, well, how come Luke and Matthew both completely independently of each other decide to put a birth narrative before they start doing the Markan narrative? And then how come they coincide on all of these details, like the idea that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, that there's an annunciation from an angel, that Jesus is going to be conceived of a virgin, all of this stuff. So you then have to go back to our old friend oral tradition to explain all of these complex similarities.
Yeah, but at the same time, when you look at them, so in Luke, they're running into Jerusalem after Jesus' birth, but in Matthew, they're just running out of Jerusalem, going to Egypt.
Yeah, out to Bethlehem, yeah.
Yeah, to Bethlehem. So these things that, to me, they're so sharp that if Luke knew these, Matthew, so why he just changed the story? It's very, to me, it's very dramatic change. And I really don't understand how...
Writers change their sources dramatically all the time. Otherwise, why bother write? If you're just going to write the same story.
But Dr. Goodacre, what's the base of his information that he changed? My point is, if he knew Matthew write something, I don't know. Probably he knew that Matthew get from Mark because he get from Mark too.
Yeah.
But the rest of the story, that Magi, and then angel of the Lord talking with Joseph here. But in Luke, angel of the Lord said to Mary, name Jesus, right? But in Matthew is different. So my point is, if he knew these things, but he changed them based on what? Based on the truth? Based on the eyewitnesses? Based on what you changed the story?
There are obviously different possibilities here. I tend to be on the source side, something of a minimalist. So I think that Luke's own creative abilities are sufficient to explain how he composed that story. Only a few decades later, another gospel, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Proto-Gospel of James, expands the story even further. And it's not that the author of that has been talking to a bunch of eyewitnesses, I don't think, or that he's got this great lake of oral tradition. It's that he's another creative writer. People wrote and rewrote these stories over and over again. Now, some people would find that, I know some people balk at the idea that the gospel writers made things up. But it is what authors did in antiquity, just as they do today. If you watch that TV show, The Chosen, the vast majority of that, and it's a very, very traditional picture of Jesus, the vast majority of it is made up.
Yes.
It's like creative fiction spun around the
Mm.
source material. So the reason why people balk at it for Luke or John or whoever is that it's in the Bible. And they just really worry about the idea that something in the Bible might have a kind of creative literary element. But everybody accepts on some level that there has to be some creativity, even if it's just that you move the person doing the storytelling. So, one thing, for example, Mark will frequently narrate something and use the narrator's voice. And then you
Uh-huh.
get to Matthew's gospel, and in Matthew, what the narrator is saying in Mark has gone into Jesus's mouth in Matthew. A famous example is when Jesus at the Last Supper, in Mark's gospel, the narrator says, they all ate of this, right? And in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is the one who says, drink, they all drank of this. And then in Matthew's gospel, all of you drink of this. Jesus tells them to do it. Now, the thing is, what's happened obviously is that Matthew's taken something that the narrator says and puts it into Jesus' mouth. He does the same thing at the beginning of Matthew 26. In Mark's gospel, it was now 2 days before the Passover, the narrator says. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, it is now 2 days before the Passover. Now, it's obvious to me that what's happened is that this is the creative author of Matthew's
Yeah.
gospel who's making the change. So everybody on some level accepts that. It's just that some people think that the creativity goes a little further,
Uh-huh.
and other people just find that they're worried about that, and so they appeal to sources and oral traditions and so on. But I mean, who wrote those sources and the oral traditions? Are they? Is there any creative,
Yes.
in there?
Agreed. Thank you. So let me shift the conversation and ask you about the character of Barabbas.
Yeah.
Because that's very interesting. I started reading something. A couple of days ago, I was watching you on that course, Synoptic, Mysteries of Synoptic
Mm-hmm.
Gospels, and that you answer, and you just talk about like Barabbas very short, and I started a little bit reading on Barabbas, and it's just
Sure.
very interesting to me that is it the real historical figures or this is a creativity of Matthew because you put it beside Jesus Barabbas or
Mm-hmm.
Barabbas Jesus or Jesus Son of God, or it's just very interesting. I just
I
want
mean,
to,
yeah.
yeah.
No, no, you're right. It's fascinating. I mean, he's in all 4 canonical gospels. Only Matthew, as you say, has him called Jesus Barabbas, and that's only in some manuscripts. I think it's original to Matthew in the sense that you can see why some scribes might have felt uneasy about there being 2 Jesuses there. So it's
Yeah.
more likely that scribes took it out
Yeah.
than that, they put it in.
Yeah, even I read the Origin once said this is very blasphemous that somebody notorious named Jesus Barabbas. He
Yeah.
gets very nervous with that. But do you think that the Barabbas was actual historical figures, or this is a creativity of the author of Matthew?
It's well, certainly not of Matthew because he appears in Mark before Matthew. But I mean, like Matthew does supply the name Jesus. But is he a historical character? Quite possibly. I mean, whether he's a historical character or not, the way that he seems to function in Mark is interesting because he's someone who's got arrested during the riot or the rebellion, right? That's what Mark says. And that's kind of interesting because does that mean that there was some sort of riot rebellion around about the time when Jesus was arrested too? So it's kind of plausible that there was someone else arrested at the same time as Jesus. All the more as Jesus is crucified alongside 2 bandits or brigands or insurrectionists, so perfectly plausible that there was another one too and that he was called Barabbas. The reason why some people are skeptical about his historicity is exactly the thing you say, which is that Barabbas means son of the father. And so, do you end up here with a kind of really interesting symbolic Jesus being crucified instead of this son of the father? I mean, I find that a very appealing reading. But in a way, that doesn't affect whether it's historical or not, because something can be historical and still have a symbolic meaning,
Is it possible that the Barabbas was actually historical figures, but the name has been like
It
invention
could
of.
easily be something like that, yeah. Because, like I say, I mean, no one seriously doubts the story of the two guys being crucified with Jesus. We don't have their
Uh-huh.
names, so yeah, it is possible. Yeah, I haven't really got any problem with the idea of him being historical. I don't know how we would verify it because we simply don't have the source material to. But in principle, sure, I don't see why he shouldn't be. I mean, you've got characters mentioned in Mark's Passion narrative where their children are mentioned. So you've
Uh-huh.
got Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, at one end of Mark's Passion story. And then at the other end of Mark's Passion story, you've got Mary of James the Less and Joseph. So each end of the Passion narrative, or at least of the crucifixion story, we do have named witnesses who have children. And it's unusual to name the children. So one of the small bits of sense that you might be able to make of that is maybe the children are the ones that told the stories. So maybe there's a bit of an origin story there. And if we're doubtful about whether there could have been someone called Alexander, the son of Simon of Cyrene, we
Uh-huh.
do actually have an ossuary in Jerusalem with that written on it. Or we haven't got one with Barabbas written on it, let alone Jesus Barabbas, but we do have one of the other characters from Mark's Passion narrative, might not be the same person, but it might be. There's someone called Rufus that's mentioned in Romans 16 as well. So,
Uh-huh.
maybe that's the same thing as well. We don't know.
Uh-huh.
Always difficult with ancient history because our knowledge is so slight.
Interesting. So another question that this is actually my personal question. So if the four writer of our four canonical gospel were a Greek speaking person
Hmm.
in first century and they were kind of remote from Palestine, they had
Hmm.
nothing to do with eyewitness testimony, they were not a disciple. The question just remained for me is this: if they're completely kind of they don't know anything about Aramaic language, why we have Aramaic terms?
Right.
I mean, how? I mean,
Absolutely. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
understand that
I
honestly.
mean, yeah, I'm genuinely bowled over when I read, especially Mark's Gospel, seeing those Aramaic terms popping up. Yeah, I mean, I don't think Mark's made those up or added them for color. I assume he's got those from whatever his source material is. I mean, Talitha cum, we have when he's raising Jairus' daughter. The very term Abba, I mean, I suppose he could have got Abba, father from Paul. But then this same gospel has the line, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani at the cross. And, so we could go on. I mean, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. It lends Mark an air of verisimilitude at key points. Of course, we can never again with ancient history go beyond that since we haven't got anything to check it against. Like in Matthew's case, we can check Matthew against Mark, we can check
Uh-huh.
Luke against Mark. Very difficult because we haven't got anything to check Mark against. But I don't think it's unreasonable that Mark's source material features someone who knows Aramaic, in which case that stuff may well go back to Jesus. Yeah, absolutely.
So, do you think that the author of Mark Gospel knew Aramaic language as well, or?
I don't know. I mean, it's possible. It's possible because his Greek's fairly colloquial, but it's entirely possible.
I think I heard the argument. I don't know if were you or somebody else that I read somewhere that somebody says that a scholar who knows Aramaic actually translate Greek texts of Mark into Aramaic, and it
Hmm.
seems that the guy was like first language of the guy was like Aramaic. At least the person who wrote Mark knew. I don't know if it were you or somebody else, but
That's not me. I mean, I'm actually when we get to that kind of thing, this is where I feel that a lot of the time it's better just to say we don't know. But
uh-huh.
the problem about all that kind of retroversion, where you try and retrovert Mark's gospel or Q or whatever into Aramaic, is there's so much power that the interpreter has to choose the language that they're retroverting into because there's no checks and balances there. So so I can give a facetious example of how retroversions are not necessarily correct.
Uh-huh.
In Matthew 23, you get a line about how the blood of Abel, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, these things will, be judging you. Now, there we've got Abel to Zechariah, A to Z or A to Z,
Okay.
depending on. Now, that doesn't prove that Jesus spoke Latin, right? Where A is the first letter of the alphabet and Z is the last letter of the alphabet. It's pure coincidence. And it's because Abel is at one end of the Hebrew Bible, and Zechariah, whoever it is that Matthew's referring to, is towards the other end of it. So, we have to be really careful doing those retroversions. See, a lot of the time, our lack of knowledge as ancient historians makes us want to overclaim about the stuff that we can know. And sometimes we do just have to say, I don't know. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't speculate. I love speculating, but we should always own the speculation, say, here I am speculating.
Dr. Goodacre, how about this? So these are my question that last night I started thinking some question that I have. Why? I mean, Paul, half of the New Testament actually written by Paul, right? Almost. So why we don't have a gospel according to Paul? So
some people would say that to varying degrees, that is what we have, because Mark's gospel, a lot of people would say, is a kind of Pauline retelling of the gospel story. And I think, a lot of the features of Mark's gospel make sense if it's written by someone who's Pauline. In which case, Mark's gospel is kind of a Petrine gospel in Pauline, Paul's theology, as it were, and Paul's perspective superimposed on a Petrine tradition. And also, to an extent, it's what we've got in Luke, isn't it? Because in Luke's gospel, obviously, Paul's not mentioned, but in Acts of the Apostles, gradually it turns out that Paul is going to be the hero. So in that sense, Luke's gospel is a prequel to the story of the apostles, which climaxes with Paul taking the gospel to Rome. So to an extent, we do have Paul's influence there on the gospels. And others would also point out how similar John's theology can be to Paul's theology, So I think we do have it there. And a lot of people say Matthew is at least to a certain extent, reacting against Paul.
Yes.
So I mean, I think it's easy to see Paul's influence there. I mean, I'm not a pan Paulinist, like seeing Paul everywhere, but equally the other end of the spectrum, not seeing Paul anywhere is equally not seeing Paul anywhere is problematic.
So do you think that the historical Paul
I would. So that's my favorite romantic.
If yes, my question is, if yes, why he completely silent when it comes to birth of Jesus? I mean, in Paul writing, if he knew Luke, and Luke was just the birth narrative, but we don't have anything from Paul. Like in Galatians 4:4, he could say Jesus comes from not woman but Parthenos, but he never says that.
No, right. When in fact, Galatians 4:4, born of a woman, is pretty telling. That he doesn't. He could have added a line or two there. It's what makes me wonder whether any of the early Christians knew much about Jesus's birth. But with respect to if you're looking at the other way around, if Luke knows Paul, then that means that the author of the Gospel and Acts was a companion of Paul. That then becomes, if that's true, it does become interesting, because that character in Acts of the Apostles not only knows Paul, but he knows people like Silas, who's from Jerusalem. And one of the we passages in Acts is in Acts 21, where he goes and meets James. He's very reluctant. He doesn't call James the brother of Jesus, but we know from other contexts that he's the brother of Jesus. So if Luke is the companion of Paul, then he did know people that were involved with the early Christian movement. My difficulty is, basically, I want to believe that, and it may be true. My difficulty is that if Luke knows Josephus, which I'm sure he does, then really the earliest we can date Luke to is the end of the 1st century. If Luke is knocking around with Paul in the 50s, it does make him oldish by this point. So it feels more likely that the we passages and so on, it's more likely that they're pseudonymous. But there's a large part of me that just holds out hope that maybe he is that guy. Probably the biggest argument for Luke being a companion of Paul is, who would attribute a gospel to such a minor character? It was a really minor character. This guy isn't even one of Paul's main companions. He's just someone that gets a little mention at the end of Philemon, a little mention at the end of Colossians, and a little mention in one of the pastoral epistles. And that's it. It's so minor. So who attributes a gospel to him? That's curious. So that just does make you think, maybe Luke was Luke. I want to believe that. I want to believe that. Okay. I'm not sure if I do, that I want to believe that.
Okay. So the question about the Paul and historical Jesus, because I
Mm,
know that you were quite involved in historical Jesus research and you're teaching courses on that. So why Paul doesn't know almost, I mean, few things he knows about historical Jesus. He never
hmm.
mentioned Jesus parables. He never mentioned
Right.
about the betray of Jesus by Judas. He never named Jesus' mother. He never named, Jesus' birth. He never named any
Hmm.
of miraculous or big things that Jesus did. I mean, does this guy actually know historical Jesus, or no? Just get everything from a spiritual being, just dreams and things like that.
No, I think he knows tons of stuff about Jesus. I mean, if you read 1 Corinthians, I mean, he keeps referring to Jesus' tradition in that epistle. And he's clearly not making that stuff up, because there are people in Corinth that have an allegiance to Peter. Like 1 Corinthians 1 to 4, there's basically four parties: the Paul party, the Peter party, the Apollos party, and the Christ party. So you've got people in Corinth that appeal to Peter's authority. You'd be really stupid if you as Paul were making stuff up, attributing it to Jesus, and then telling it to people, many of whom have an alliance with Peter. I mean, and in 1 Corinthians 15, we
Uh-huh.
get the line that he appeared to Peter. And clearly, Paul's not made that up. It doesn't serve his interest to make that up. And if it wasn't well known that he'd appeared to Peter, some of those people in Corinth will go, "No, he didn't. What's he talking about?" Right? So no, I think there's quite a lot of Jesus material in 1 Corinthians. And there's the divorce saying, there's a saying about mission, institution of the Eucharist in 1 Corinthians 11. All right, he doesn't mention Judas there, but he does say on the night that he was handed
Yeah,
over,
but yeah,
which
but
is
I mean,
kind
I mean,
of
I mean,
striking.
I read E.P. Sanders' book, The Jesus Figures. I mean, he
Yeah.
just lists like 7 or 8 things that he knows about historical Jesus, not more
Hmm.
than that. And the
Hmm.
question is, if this person actually met with the pillars, so-called pillars in
Yeah.
Jerusalem, but I mean, sometimes when I read some of his epistles, so it seems to me that if he knew historical Jesus, he could add something from Jesus to make his argument more stronger.
Hmm.
And it seems that, yeah.
Well, I don't think Paul knew the historical Jesus. I mean, he knew stuff about him, which he'd found out from people like Peter. I mean, he spent 2 weeks with him. He says in Galatians 1, and presumably, as C.H. Dodd, I was talking about earlier, C.H. Dodd said, presumably they weren't talking about the weather for the whole of those 2 weeks. So, he knows stuff, but he doesn't know, I don't think he knew Jesus personally. I'm pretty sure his epistles don't make sense if he actually knew Jesus personally, but he's got traditions from these other guys. And the reason why he doesn't appeal to them all the time, I think, is twofold. One is that a lot of the time, there probably isn't a relevant Jesus saying that people knew. So if Jesus had said anything about circumcising Gentiles, you can be sure that people would have mentioned this to the Galatians.
Mhm.
But that doesn't come up as an argument, as far as we can tell. So Jesus probably didn't talk about that issue, and it didn't help him out. But on the other hand, Jesus did say some stuff about the end times, and Paul seems to quote it in 1 Thessalonians 4. So Jesus did say some stuff about divorce. He was probably, like John the Baptist, scandalized by Herod Antipas marrying his brother's wife, Herodias. That divorce issue comes up in Jesus' teaching, and Paul knows that and quotes it in 1 Corinthians 7. So a lot of the time it's just because of the occasional nature of these things that you mention Jesus's sayings when you've got some to mention and when they're
Mm.
relevant. But I think the other side of it is, if you're Paul and you're not always getting on kind of brilliantly with Peter or James, Jesus's brother, it actually isn't very wise of you in those kind of contexts to keep quoting Jesus' tradition, because they had the direct knowledge of Jesus, which Paul doesn't. So I think it's also partly a rhetorical thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense for Paul to do it.
1 Corinthians 15, when he talks about appearances, he never mentioned woman. But in four canonical
Mhm,
gospel, I
mhm.
mean, Jesus appeared to woman, was a female, not male.
Well,
But
you see, I think there are women there, though. I think the problem is we read 1 Corinthians 15 in the light of the Gospels, where those women, especially Mary Magdalene, are really prominent. But Paul does say that Jesus appeared to James and then all of the apostles. Now, if we're assuming that all of them are men, then that's not an assumption that Paul makes, Paul actually names one of the apostles Junia in Romans 16:7. So
Oh,
she's there by implication. And also, I assume that when Paul says that he appeared to 500 people, that they're not all men. There are probably about 250 of them are women as well. So actually, there are more women in 1 Corinthians 15 than there are at the end of the Gospels. That's a bit of a
yeah.
cheeky thing to say, but
Yeah.
I'm only saying it. I'm only saying it to be sort of, I don't know,
Yeah, I mean, because
to be spoil sport.
yeah, because I mean, when you read the Gospels, I mean, these Gospel mention that women by name go into
Hmm.
the tomb,
That's right, of course, yeah.
but I mean, if he just mentioned 500 people, and then
Hmm.
we assume that there were women among them, which is likely, but I
Hmm.
mean, that's a hypothesis, I guess. It's very hard to say for certain.
The apostles bit is easier, though, isn't it? Because we know that there are women apostles.
Yeah, I mean, I understand about Junius in
Hmm.
in Romans
Hmm.
16:7, but I mean to me, it seems that he kind of neglecting that part that to mention women going there, and
Right, right, and it bothers me a lot. I mean, is it? And I just don't know which way round it goes. I hope it's that Paul knows full well about those traditions, but just chooses not to narrate them because of where he's going. Because he wants to say he appeared, he appeared, he appeared, and last of all, he appeared to me, which means that you don't necessarily tell the gospel story about the vacated tomb. I hope it's that reason. The the other possible reason is that Paul doesn't mention them because they hadn't been invented yet. I mean, that's the problematic answer for those of us that want to see some history there. In other words, you know, maybe Paul doesn't mention Mary Magdalene because he's never heard of her. And maybe he doesn't mention her because, Mark hasn't yet composed that story. I don't know. I mean, if I
Mm.
wanted to take a stab at it, I think that those women are historical at the end of Mark's gospel. But it is baffling that they don't pop up elsewhere.
It's very hard to think that he doesn't know anything about Mary Magdalene. I mean, he's just all over the place. I
Well,
mean,
all over the place in the Gospels, but he hasn't
yeah,
read the
in the
Gospels,
Gospels,
so
but my point is, if he's right in Galatians
yeah,
1 and 2 that
yeah,
he met the pillars, or
yeah,
I
yeah.
mean Peter, and then Peter
Hmm.
knew that, I mean, Jesus appeared to Mary, that was the first woman that Jesus appears, and then
Hmm.
the Paul doesn't mention that. It
But
seems.
it's interesting though, isn't it? Because what he actually says there in Galatians 1, he says that I didn't see any of the other apostles. And then he goes, oh, except James, the brother of the Lord, right? So we actually know that at least, so there he hasn't talked to Junior or Mary Magdalene or, Salome, assuming that these people, would have been people that Paul called apostles if they were around then. So
Mhm.
he does actually, Peter and James, and they're the two heads of each list in 1 Corinthians 15. In fact, they're the only named people in that list. You get Peter, then the 12, then James, then all the apostles, then the 500, right? So you've got Peter and James heading those two lists. And they're the two people that Paul says he talked to in Galatians 1, which is really interesting. So, see, the other possibility is you've got different streams, haven't you? You've got one stream, which
Mhm.
is the sort of Peter and James, which stresses the appearance side of things. And maybe there's another stream, which ends up in Mark's gospel and then the others, which focuses on the tomb and the presence of Mary Magdalene and co. But even
Mhm.
it's so frustrating because the Gospels, even Mark is inconsistent about what the women's names are. He first off says Mary of James the Less and Joseph, and then and plus Mary Magdalene plus Salome. Then when we get to the tomb, we're down to Mary of James and Mary Magdalene, and then later on it's Mary of Joseph. So even the names of the women are not completely consistent in Mark. And then we get to Luke's gospel and we get someone called Joanna, who Luke's mentioned earlier on, so she's turned up there as well. And of course, some people would say those sorts of interesting inconsistencies show that people like Luke had extra information. Maybe he knew about a Joanna, who'd had a resurrection appearance and so on. I don't know. It's endlessly fascinating to ask those
Mhm.
questions.
Beautiful. And the last question, because I know it's more than an hour. last question that is actually my thesis that I'm working on is this. So if Matthew and Luke has been preserved quite extensively, 2nd century, 3rd century, we have a lot of copies. Why Mark has been copied
Mm-hmm.
among them? If
Yeah.
there's, I don't know, 95% or whatever percent that we have
Mm-hmm.
from Mark into these two gospels, why Mark
Yeah,
has been
it's amazing.
preserved?
It's a fantastic thing. I mean, we're so lucky that people did carry on copying Mark, and I think it does actually say something for Mark's antiquity, that people really knew that this was an important gospel and kept on copying it in spite of the fact they also wanted to copy Matthew
Uh-huh.
and Luke. To some extent, the 95% figure, though, is a little misleading, because it's true that the contents of Mark, like the specific stories and sayings, the vast majority of them are found in Matthew or Luke or both. But frequently, the Markan versions are much longer. So if you take a classic example, the Gerasene demoniac is in
Uh-huh.
Mark 5, 1 to 20, 20 verses of Mark's gospel. And when we say, well, that appears in Matthew's gospel, it does. But in Matthew's gospel, it's just like this tiny little paragraph. It's a fraction of the size of Mark's story. So when we say that story and a bunch of others occur in Matthew, well, there's reason to hang on to Mark, because Mark's got these fuller, more elaborate versions of lots of the stories. The very next story as well, the healing of Jairus' daughter and the woman with a flow of blood, Mark 5, 21 to 43. 20, what's that? Is that 22 verses? Something like that. 22 verses in Mark. Huge story. You go to Matthew's gospel, just a tiny little paragraph on that. Now, admittedly, Luke does have fuller versions that come closer to the Markan versions, but even Luke's versions are significantly abbreviated. So that's one of the obvious reasons to retain Mark, because Mark does have such, it has these brilliantly told stories with these memorable details.
So I think another thing that in Mark that it's just quite fascinating. It's about messianic secret that it's
Mm-hmm.
just more vivid than any. Do we have it in Luke and Matthew?
Less so. I mean, so elements of it are retained, but elements of it they play down. So
Uh-huh.
it's in fact, it's one of the reasons for thinking Markan priority is so persuasive, because you've got the messianic secret appearing less frequently in Matthew and Luke, so that
Uh-huh.
if Mark wasn't the first gospel, it would be a very strange person that managed to sort of knit together those bits of Matthew and Luke and then expand it. I mean, it could happen, but it's the people that have made that case have generally not been very persuasive.
Interesting. Dr. Goodacre, I mean, I would love to talk to you another 2 hours, but I know your time is precious. So, but for people following, just this is the newest book by Dr. Goodacre. Please, I can pin it in the first comment. You guys can pick it up
Thank you. It's
and
very kind.
buy it. It's around like 200 pages,
Mm-hmm.
but it's very readable, and I hope you guys pick it up. 2016 has been published. And like four views of a synoptic problem that Dr. Goodacre has a big chapter on it. So pick up these two books.
I don't get any royalties from that book, though. So, so you don't have to worry about buying that. And for those people, because I know that lots of people won't have the money to get those. If you don't have any money, I do have a lot of materials available on my website. Just Google my name, and also I have my own YouTube channel and podcast. So be very happy for people to.
Can you mention the name of the YouTube channel? It was like NT Pod.
Yes. If you Google NT Pod, you'll get to it. The YouTube channel is actually called Podacre, which is a pun on my name, Podacre. So I just call it Podacre because
I can pin that down below for
okay,
people
cool.
to follow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Goodacre. It was pleasure.
Thank you,
to have
Payman.
you.
It's a real pleasure. Yeah. Really fun questions, and I love the fact that occasionally when I have these kind of conversations, people won't push back. And it's really fun that you actually push back out. It makes it much more entertaining for me. Okay. I hope for the viewers as well, but certainly it helps me to.
So I hope to meet you in SBL this coming year.
So.
Yeah, Denver. See you there. Yeah. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.